2, 1.
Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higinbotham and I'll be your host for this evening's program. If you're like me, you love our parks. They are the best. In fact, they were said to be the best in the country in both 2013 and 2014. But as you're walking through those parks, do you notice that maybe that recreation center that your kids used to play soccer in doesn't look quite as good as it did 10 years ago, and the path could use a little spiffing up here and there? Well, that's probably one of the things that we're going to talk a bit about tonight, because the League of Women Voters has just is in the process of doing a study on protecting the public interest, and of course that's our interest in the park system. Our guests this evening are two women from the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. Our first guest is Julie Wallace. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
And our other guest is Margaret Berg. Well, so protecting the public interest is the name of the study, and why did the League decide to do this now?
Yes. Well, the League was encouraged by a League member, Meg Forney, who was recently elected to the Park Board, to say that there are some interesting issues coming up before the Park Board that really deserved a look from a group like the League that tries to look at civic issues and take a look at them. And while we're not yet doing a full-blown study, we're starting to look at these issues and inform ourselves. And she pointed out two big issues that I know will be coming up during this discussion. One of them is a new Parkland Dedication ordinance, which is a whole new way of making sure that new development is...
we are going to talk about that.
Yes, we are. It's supported by parks. And then the other issue is what's going on down near the stadium at the downtown, what's now being called Downtown East. So those deserved a look, and we are in the midst now of looking at those issues. We don't have any answers yet, but we're getting better at articulating the questions.
Well, that is the first place to start. The League always starts with the questions.
Right.
Well, now, so the thing that, as I said in the introduction, we have a wonderful park system, but it costs a lot of money, and it just seems like there's some things that aren't quite as nice as we'd like them to be.
Well, they're getting increased use, and so of course the wear and tear of ordinary use is starting to really show, particularly because so many of our recreational buildings were built in the 1960s and in the 1970s, and the standards at that time were pretty different from what we expect nowadays. And one of those things being air conditioning, and those buildings are being used very differently now. We are having lots of preschool and after-school programs, and so I know it's really hard to deal with a large number of kids in the building when it's so warm in the summers, and of course our climate is changing. So it's that heating is a problem, and I know the wear and tear on the playgrounds and so forth. So we're not keeping up with the capital improvements that need to be made, and so I know that we really need to be spending probably around $14 million a year.
And right now
we're spending more like 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we're really slipping behind.
Well, now the question I have is, we all love those parks so dearly. Mm-hmm. Why are people not willing to spend a little more money?
Well, I think it isn't really that people are not willing. People haven't really been asked. The Park Board's budget is not set by the Park Board.
Right.
It involves the city.
Probably tell folks, how is it set?
Yes. Well, the budgeting part is rather complex, and we haven't fully.
Right.
But there is money, of course, from the city, from the taxpayers. But of the full tax that Minneapolis people pay, only 8 cents goes to the parks. And then capital improvements go through the city's Capital Long Range Improvement Committee, and they propose things, but they're on the same table as all other capital improvements in the city, and so they certainly get supported, but not. There's been so much deferred maintenance that the building problems just get worse and worse.
It's easy to put things off.
Exactly, and there is some state money that comes to the park board, but that's mainly for the regional parks and not the neighborhood centers.
And I guess the superintendent of parks, Jane Miller, did articulate in her State of the Parks message and budget message that there have been some new expenses, certainly all the ADA requirements, and that's been hard in these old
Americans with disabilities.
Yeah. That's increased the costs. Of course, we have new minimum wage, although I don't think that that's going to be a big factor. But health care costs have certainly risen for everybody. And so I think for all those reasons, it just costs more.
Yeah. Well,
They already have laid off. We have a much smaller park staff, about 19% less than we had about 6 years ago.
More people using the parks, but less staff.
Right. Right.
Of course, that's administrative as well as staff, and they're trying to staff the buildings now when they're most used, which is 3 o'clock and late after.
Well, and now you said there are more people using it. Are there more parks too than there were, say, 20 years ago?
There are not many more neighborhood level parks. The regional parks are expanding to some extent, and we'll probably be talking about some of that. And the Parkland Dedication ordinance is a way that there may be new parks put in new places where people are living for the first time.
Now, this is a really interesting thing, this Parkland Dedication ordinance. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly it is, why we're doing it, and what it's going to mean.
Well, the concept of a Parkland Dedication ordinance has been around for quite a long time, but it really started more in the suburban areas and in the newer developing areas, where they wanted to make sure that the developers put some money aside in order that they could have parkland available for the new residents in an area. And so the concept, this was just passed about 2 years ago in Minneapolis, and it went into effect at the beginning of 2014, so it's only been in effect for a year. And what it means is that a developer, depending whether or not they're developing residential or commercial or industrial areas, has to apply. They've got 3 choices. They can give money, and our ordinance says that about each new residential unit, they'll have to pay $1,500.
Each, like of 200 apartment units, that would be 200 times $1,500.
Yeah.
So we're talking.
It's a one-time fee.
Right. We're talking some significant
Or
money,
they
though.
can give some land, if it's land that could be utilized by the park board and the city, where it fits into the long-range plan. Or they have a third option, and that is to provide public space, their privately owned space for public use. And we have our first example of that, which is just being approved. It was approved 2 weeks ago.
By the park board.
By the park
The city
board.
still has to approve it.
in February.
Yes.
Well, now, okay, when I read that was curious to me. So you keep the land, you still own the land, but then you have to let the city use it, and do you determine how they're going to use it, or you as the owner get to determine that?
It's a negotiated agreement, and the city council and the park board has to both agree to it, as well as the developer.
And you said we have our first example.
Our first example is taking place down near the river, right off 2nd Street. It's kind of where the 3rd Avenue Bridge comes across the river on the downtown side. And Ecumen is building a complex of 150 units for elders, and they're a group that Steve Min is involved in, Eagle Iron Works, I believe is the name of it, is building some subsidized, or I don't know if it's subsidized, it's housing that's more affordable. And so they are providing some land, a strip of land that has been owned by the railroad that goes between the 2 buildings. And what it's going to do that's really makes everybody pretty happy is it's going to make a connection between downtown Minneapolis and the river, because there's so many large buildings
Right,
along
so
the
this will
river.
be
Think
like
of-
sort of a parkish space between the two buildings?
and it has a real private use during the day for parking. There's going to be 75 to 80 parking spaces on either side of this road. And then in the evenings, it will be used for public parking, and on the weekends it can be used for public parking. But people can walk through it anytime, and it's their avenue to the
So
river.
now there's this gigantic apartment building that's proposed for Nicollet and Fifth or something
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that. Well, now, do they have to provide a certain amount? I mean, there's not any space around their building, so...
Well, if there's no space around the building and they can't dedicate land, normally they pay the fee. And for most developers, from what I've been told, paying the fee is the easiest thing. Needless to say, that fee gets passed on to the ultimate consumer, one can assume. But that is, for some, the simplest way. However, the trick is much of the new development that we're seeing got their permits before January 1st of 2014, in which
Really?
case they're not covered by this. This only went into effect January 1st of 2014.
Not
So-
2015, but 2014.
2014. So it's been a little more than a year, but a lot of those, in fact, one of the articles in the paper said that there was a real rush
I
to
can
get
imagine.
the permits in place before. So all of the newer developments that are going up, there's one on the east side that's called the Superior Plating. That's a big deal, and that hasn't, that will be involved. But some of the others got in under the wire.
But the whole purpose is to assure that there will be parklands or open space for these new residents and the new commercial and
Now, this is, I mean,
retailers,
they gave
too.
some examples. This is significant money for some of the suburbs, right?
we didn't set ours as high as a lot of the suburbs. I believe Woodbury charges about 3 times as much as we do, and I know the city council was very reluctant to institute a really high fee
Why?
because they didn't want to discourage development. Now, this could be changed, at any time.
The park board proposed a considerably higher fee, more in line with what the suburbs of Minneapolis do. But the city was concerned about discouraging developments. But there is also a part of the ordinance says that if you're building affordable housing, you are excused from paying this fee, and so that makes it still possible to encourage some of the kinds of housing that the city is
Well, that's a
trying
good thing, too.
Yeah.
Well, I noted, as I recall, it was $875,000 that one of the suburbs got for
Yes.
these fees in a year?
In a year, yes.
Our first year was just over $200,000
But
from
still,
57
that's
projects.
still a
Yeah. It's
help.
something, but it doesn't buy you a park.
No, and it doesn't get from 4 million to 14 million or what.
Right.
And just quickly, the money needs to be used to provide access or new parks or to improve parks. It can't be used for maintenance, and it has to be used within 1/2 mile of the development.
Wow.
that's
So in other
going on.
words, it's really capital investments. It's not salaries or
Right.
maintenance.
Right. No,
Yeah.
no.
So now so that we'll all know about this. This is called the Parkland Dedication Ordinance.
Right.
Correct.
Yes.
Now, and the other thing that I was interested in was what's happening down by the stadium. Now, it's called Downtown East Commons. I didn't exactly know where that was until I read this. But now, what exactly there's been a lot of controversy about who's doing what down there. What is happening?
Well, that can hardly be explained in
In a half an hour?
Yes, exactly. And it only involves the park board at this point in a what should we say, a lower profile way, because the arrangement that was made between the city and the Sports Facilities Commission, mostly the Vikings, was for a large part of the time for it to be used for their activities, some rallies and some private things and that sort of thing. And the park board realized that maintaining that space would cost a couple of $1 million a year, and to have that and then not have the land available all the time for the public was not a comfortable fit for the park board. So after a great deal of negotiation, an arrangement was made that involved the park board and the Sports Facilities Commission and the developer of the properties around there, so that ultimately the park board owns the land but is not doing any of the development. It will own the land. It will own the land in the long run if possibly after, well, it's hard to say because you can always extend agreements, but the park board owns the land but is leasing it to the city, which is leasing it to the developer.
That will happen in 2016.
Yes, it will happen.
I guess the thing we do need to say is this arrangement came about because of a legal case that was brought, because there was a big dispute between the City Council and the Park Board and the Sports Facilities Commission over who can own parkland in the city. Because this Park Board is independently elected, but it's really semi-autonomous. It does have to share some things with the City Council, but clearly in our city charter, it does say that parkland is to be owned by the Park Board. It can be, I mean, they can work with the City Council, and that's one of the things the judge said, is there is nothing that precludes the City Council and the Park Board from working together.
Well, as I recall, at the very outset, the Park Board said, thanks, but no thanks.
Right, exactly.
Because they didn't have the money.
They couldn't possibly pay for doing it. What's interesting now is that there is a process starting now of a large committee and then another large technical advisory committee looking at the actual details of how they're going to do that park. And that involves a whole lot of agencies and neighborhoods and private groups. And the park board is involved in that. And it will talk about both, the physical development of the parks and how they might be used. Someone mentioned to us that maybe they'll have soccer fields that people from even across the river could come and use. So there is a relatively public process now going on about planning for how that park will develop. But
I think we need to mention that the Downtown Council is very much involved in this, because in fact, they are kind of spearheading something called Greening Downtown Minneapolis, which has come out of their long-range plan. And they really want to, or they feel that there's going to need to be a combination of new kinds of monies to maintain this downtown park, the downtown east.
Are they speaking of trees or money?
Both, probably. That's a good question.
Money for trees.
So the Trust for Public Land has been contracted with to come up with the new model for running this downtown East Commons, and it will be called a conservatory. Conservancy, excuse me. That model has been used in Chicago for the Grant Park, and it's been used in New York for Bryant Park. And so they're thinking that's what they would like to use here in Minneapolis. And so that would allow them to raise funds from downtown businesses, as well as from probably public entities and private individuals. So there's, as we have these new large public park projects, and especially we probably want to talk a little bit about the river, what's going on down there. We are going to have to use some new kinds of ways of funding these things.
Sources.
And of course, density will help that too. I mean, just by having more people living in the city, which is, I think, a real strategy of the City Council right now, we will have more money for parks too.
But more people using it too.
Right,
yes,
right.
Well, just a quickie, how big is that space? Downtown East Commons, is it many blocks?
I think it's they say it's 3.5 acres about. It's 2 square blocks.
Okay.
Yeah, just east. It's between the stadium and the what am I trying to say? the
Portland,
historic
I
building.
believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
now the
It's
river.
where the Star Tribune building is now. It's
Oh.
going to be torn down,
Okay.
and that will
Oh,
be the
that's
park.
right. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Well, now the river. I love the river, and for many
Yeah.
years we've sort of ignored the river and not done nice things to it. Now we're getting all excited about the river.
Oh,
And I noticed that some things are going to happen now. It's upstream, right? From
There are three sections of the river. One is the gorge, which is the lower part, and that's pretty much under control. You know, that's where we have the river roads.
That's
and
really
that
been
sort
in
of
the
thing.
public domain
It's all
since
been
the
in
beginning.
Is that like
public
the
domain.
university
Yeah,
down
and then
there?
yes, right, and then there's the central riverfront, which a citizens advisory group has said that we need to rename that the St. Anthony Falls.
and that's where St.
But
Anthony Falls is.
That's where St. Anthony Falls is.
Nicollet
but,
Island.
But it has been called Central Riverfront. And then everything above the falls is called Above the Falls. And that's where there is the least public space now, and lots of issues about finding space along the river for trails and extending river roads and all that sort of thing. But the central, of course, because it's downtown, is kind of exciting, and it has the falls. Even though it won't have the lock, it'll have the falls.
But is there going to be any parkish development by the falls?
One of the largest things that's really under development right now, or it will be, there's fundraising going on right now, is to do where the old Fujiya restaurant is, and it's going to be called Waterworks.
And that's on the cities. That's on the downtown
It's on the
side.
downtown side,
yeah.
and that would go from Portland Avenue to 3rd, I believe, 3rd Avenue. And so it's about a 3-block long thing. And that strip of land that we just talked about, the Wooner, is going to be, provide access to that waterworks area.
Well, now the Stone Arch Bridge is in that sort of area
And that's
too.
it.
Yes.
Okay,
So they're going to reconfigure the downtown end of the Stone Arch Bridge so that it's, right now you kind of come across and then it stops at a
That's
parking
it.
lot.
Yeah,
And
that's
so that's going to be all
Oh, that'll
smoothed
be
out. And
wonderful.
I don't think they have, I don't know what the plan is yet for the lock and dam area, the Corps of Engineers, and who's going to take that over. But I think that there's some plans in there. But they really want to make access to the river physically, so that they were even talking about being able to rent a kayak or a canoe
really?
or something down in there. They're talking about a building with a place to
Like a pavilion kind of
pavilion
thing?
kind of thing where you can
Now-
buy a
now-
meal.
The place above, I would say, what would you call above the falls?
Above the falls, yes.
And that goes all the way north to the city limits.
all the way to the city limits.
And
yes.
and that always has been like industrial area, hasn't it?
It has. Well, and the big area that's being talked about now is what's called the Upper Harbor Terminal, which obviously it's a terminal for barges. And if the locks are closed and you can't put barges through, then you'd have no need for a terminal. It never has really lived up to what was hoped anyway, but there are still some companies using it. But that is being closed down. The city owns the land that is now the Upper Harbor Terminal, but it is adjacent to the river. So the city and the park board are working together to create both some parkland, mainly along the river, I would assume, and then develop the rest of the Upper Harbor Terminal into other things, both industrial and housing.
So there still would be some industrial along that area.
Yes, it's definitely an industrial
Yeah.
area, but I think the idea is to add more newer type industries and housing and things. But that it's still under development, but it's one of those that's simpler than some things because the city actually owns the land, and it gets more complicated when you get to areas like some parts of the downtown where there are discussions about wanting to have a park, but the park board doesn't own the land, and so you have to find the money to buy the land or negotiate with the owners.
There gets to be a lot of entities involved in this. And so you've got the federal government in some cases because they have an interest in the Mississippi
river. For sure, yeah.
You have state government. The legacy funds can be used to fund some of these kinds of things if they have greater significance than just the city of Minneapolis. There's the regional funds that come through the legislature. So it's some of these massive projects. They're talking about some of these things, it will take a generation, if not more,
Wow.
to really complete them. But I guess what's exciting, when I look back at some of the league studies from years past, we were concerned about citizen participation and long-range planning and involving people in planning ahead. It's pretty amazing. If you go on the Park Board website and you can see now what's going on and the kind of planning that's going on and the involvement of people.
Yes, you
Marketing.
can join in. One of the interesting things is every single thing now that happens, either the big regional things or improving a tennis court at a local park, they have a citizen input process so that people can join a committee or be informed of what's going on. You can sign up for email alerts to be told when something new is going to happen about, Worth Park or
Wow.
the swimming pool at Weber Park or something.
Well, I just want to quickly, because we're coming toward the end here, but what's going on with Graco and the trail along the river and the easement?
Well, it's another one of those that is currently under negotiation, and there was a long-term agreement which seems to have run long enough that Graco's not quite certain that it's still.
Did it ever happen?
No. I think they agree that it happened, but there's the issue of getting a trail along the edge of Graco, which is on the east side of the river. And have a trail right along the river. But now they want to expand their headquarters, which of course is a good thing for Minneapolis. We like to have businesses expand their headquarters, but they would like to then buy some land that currently is owned by the park board in order to put their building up. The neighborhood is suggesting maybe the building could go on their parking lot. So it's one of those which day by day things may change, and I'm sure that something will work out. And certainly there will be some sort of a trail through that area, continuing up the river.
Yeah. Well, okay, so now we're just about at the end, but I've got to ask you, favorite park spot in Minneapolis? You be thinking, Julie, because you're next.
Oh gosh, I love to ride the grand rounds on my bicycle.
Ah, great.
Well, I guess I would have to say Tower Hill.
Because you live in Prospect
Because I
Park.
live in that neighborhood, and you go up to even the foot of the tower, you can see out over the city. And when you climb that tower, which you can do once a year, and then you look out over the city, and you hardly know there's a city there. You see these wonderful trees, and you see the little place with the river, and it's wonderful.
And what's your favorite? What is your favorite park in the city? I'm sure we all have a favorite one. And it is a treasure that we have to maintain, and you've heard now why the League is concerned about what's happening with our parks, and I hope as you're using them this summer you'll think about that. Thanks to our guests this evening, Julie Wallace and Margaret Berg from the League of Women Voters. This is Joan Higinbotham saying thanks for tuning in to We the People for the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. Join us again, please. Good night.